All right, let me give this a sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan, and our guest today is David.
Hi, my name is David Cerero Guerra.
And we're going to start it by kicking it off to you directly, David. Why don't you tell us who you are and what you do?
Of course. Thank you, Han, for having me here today. My name is David again. I'm a PhD candidate in political science at Yale University in the US. And I'm a researcher that is basically interested in conflict, peace, and violence. But currently I'm focused more in organized crime and how organized crime can govern communities, and they can set up governance arrangements in order to shape the lives of communities in which they are basically present.
Cool. And when you say organized crime in their relationship, what exactly are you looking at?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, basically I'm looking at, there is this idea in the literature that organized crime and other type of non-state armed actors rebel groups, militias, paramilitaries, very often they create these governance structures in which they first provide some type of services. So the most common one is security, for example. And in exchange, typically they extract some revenues from the communities in the form of extortion or security fees. And this is a kind of arrangement that typically in the political science literature, we understand as the relationship between the state and the citizens of a state. The state is providing citizens with some basic goods, typically security. Now in modern states is welfare states and things like that. And in exchange, we as citizens need to provide the state with taxes. That is kind of the relationship there. So these non-state armed actors, included criminal actors, rebels, paramilitary groups, etc., they can also create this type of arrangements among the communities in which they are present. So that is kind of what I study, and this is what we call in the literature armed governance, or specifically in my case, criminal governance. So it's the idea that criminals can basically provide services that should be provided by the state, and by doing that, they can shape the everyday lives of the citizens that are governed by them.
And so when we get into your specific work, because when you mentioned this to me originally, I was thinking about in rural areas where the state is not really present in general, places that are really underfunded, right? And there isn't too much attention, but your work actually shifts the perspective into urban areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you are completely right. Indeed, most of the literature that we have on this topic comes from rural areas. And this is, as you were saying, because most of these structures are frequently observed in rural areas where the state is not that present. Of course, this void that is left by the state because of the absence of the state gives these actors some space to create these structures of governance among residents of these rural areas. However, what we have observed in the recent decades is that also in urban areas can this happen. And this means that also armed actors that are present in urban areas and not that much in rural areas are organized crime, meaning here, criminal gangs, mafia groups, things like that. They can also kind of create these governance structures, even in areas in which typically we think that the state is more present, like cities, and this is kind of what I'm kind of focusing on now, that this is new kind of way of the literature to see that these governance structures do not require the absence of the state. They can also happen in areas where the state is also present, meaning that at the end, the governance structures that we find is not a monopoly of governance by these non-state armed actors, but more what we call mixed governance, a governance in which both actors are in this shaping the lives of these residents, both the state and the criminal actors in my case.
So presumably in a rural area, you'd have an armed group providing services almost for recruitment, right? And to kind of legitimize themselves, perhaps, maybe correct that if that's an incorrect interpretation. But then you have a situation in an urban area where the government is actually present. So what do these armed groups actually provide, or why are they even providing anything?
Okay, here's we need to understand that the variety of non-state armed actors is very huge. So we have, like, again, I was saying, like, rebel groups, militias, paramilitares, mafias, criminal gangs, youth gangs. Like, there are a huge variety of these type of actors. And some of them have, like, some incentives or some goals, and some others have others. Like, for example, a rebel, typically we understand rebels as a armed group that their first goal is to topple the government, right? They have an ideology behind, and the idea is to use coercion in order to move forward their ideology. Now, in the case of criminal actors, what typically understand of criminal actors is that their main goal is not an ideological goal, right? It's more like a criminal goal in terms of, like, moving forward their financial objectives. That is kind of the idea. Now, the goals, the huge variety of goals that these actors have, of course, matter in order to understand why are they put in shape these structures of governance that I was mentioning. As you were saying, sometimes it's because of recruitment. That happens a lot in terms of, like, rebel groups and militias, but indeed it can also happen even in urban areas with organized crime groups, because they also require labor force for working for them. And that, if you have a positive standing among a certain community, or if you can show to, let's say, for example, in the case of the criminal gangs in urban cities in Latin America, it's very important for them to show the type of life that you can get if you join the gang, right? And that is easily doable if you show to the community the kind of, like, positive benefits that the gang can bring to the community. You become kind of like this role model for the community, and that is a way to recruit youths for your organization. But there are other also objectives that you can follow by that. And indeed, in my dissertation project and the project that I'm basically just finishing right now, what I'm aiming is to show that you can also pursue these ideas in order to increase your positive standing among the community. And once you have this positive standing, you can shield yourself from the state enforcement. How? Here is basically the idea that if you keep the community on your side, they are not going to call the police on you. That is the easiest and simplest way to explain this. So the idea is that if the community sees you as a positive actor, a positive actor that, for example, basically provide security, you don't allow anyone to assault any other one here, or you solve disputes among neighbors or things like that, you are being seen by the community as a positive actor, right? And because of that, the threshold that the community is willing to accept of the type of crimes that you can perform in this community without the community calling the police on you is going to be higher. That is kind of the idea we have of my dissertation.
Yeah, so you have an interesting shift that some of these groups have taken, because usually for marketing and advertising, right, it's more of an image of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? Because most of the, if not all of the members of these gangs are young men, right? And the recruitment is all young men. But instead here, they're kind of projecting an image of reliability and community service. So do these two things go hand in hand? Are they able to kind of display their wealth, which they're ostensibly extracting from the community itself, while they provide services? Or is it that in these types of situations, their extravagance is a little bit toned down as well?
Okay, yeah, that is a good question, because even among the same type of groups, let's focus here in urban organized crime groups, and let's say more like criminal gangs, right? Even among that type of group, there is huge variation also in the type of group that you can find. Some of them are more like what we called youth gangs. This is like more like gangs that are conformed by very young people. It's more like, as you were saying, more like rock and roll lifestyle. So it's more like, let's sell these drugs and let's buy the best motorbike and let's get girls and things like that. So that is one type of criminal actor that you can find. But there is also some other criminal actors that are more mature in the way that they function and how they perceive their organization. And typically those groups are more like business oriented. They are more like, like this is for getting money and typically that has to be a lot with the experience of the group, for example. That has to be a lot with like the demographics of the group, like whether they have more experience and older members or not, So it depends, let's say, of the level of maturity of the criminal actor. And even within the same city, you can find both. So in my research, for example, I have been focused on Mexico City and Medellin. And these two examples are very nice to exemplify what I'm just saying, because what I have found in Mexico City is that many of these criminal gangs are way more disorganized, let's say, or less mature. In this sense, most of what they do is not that strategic. It's more about, like this is our way of meaning, but most of their money goes into buying drugs, alcohol, motorbikes, and things like that. So in that sense, they are not that more like long-term vision that some other criminal actors can have. On the opposite side, criminal gangs in Medellin are ones of the most organized, I will say, in Latin America for sure, but I will say in the world. And it's because of the experience that they have had. Basically, because of the large history of violence that these criminal actors have been involved with, they have learned from their mistakes. And they have learned that violence is very, very costly for them and very costly for their businesses. Basically, it's better not to invest money in firearms or something like that. Instead, it's better to use that money to invest in new drugs or increase the quality of your drug and be more competitive in your business, right? So because of that, the level of maturity, I will say, in their business minds is way higher in Medellin. And that means that how they recruit, how they perform this governance structure is way different. On one side, in the Medellin side, what we have is that because they are so business oriented, they are more strategic, they are more hierarchical, everything changes. In Mexico City, this is not like that. Of course, it's more like just like, let's put together 4 people to sell drugs. And because of that, this idea of like, okay, how we shield ourselves, how we get positive standing among the community is harder to find in a city like Mexico City.
So the picture you're painting is that the gangs in Colombia, in Medellin specifically, are almost like an establishment. They're an institution, not in a sort of formal governance sense, but they probably, maybe it's more difficult to break into the market in Medellin because you have sort of entrenchment of the power structures. Is that right?
Yeah. Like, of course, they are way more institutionalized. Indeed, there is this theory by one of my colleagues in which he describes them as that they are already domesticated. And this is not a word in the sense that they are not an actor to be afraid of or something like that. Of course, they have coercion power still, and they can produce violence if they want. When they say domesticated, is basically that they have learned from these mistakes, and because of that, they have put in place all these structures and institutions within them in order to regulate themselves, which is like a big company, let's say. So just to give you a sense of how it works, basically in Medellin, there are it depends on the source, but there are between 150 to 450 small gangs in the city, in just one city, right? And you can imagine, like in any other city of the world, that will mean violence chaos all over the place, chaos, complete chaos. And it was true in the 90s. Like most people know Pablo Escobar, basically empire was born in Medellin. That's why during the 90s and the end of the 80s, we had like one of the highest homicides rate in the world. It was the most violent city in the world and things like that. But now it's one of the most touristic places in Colombia, which is crazy. Now you go and there are just like a bunch of tourists everywhere, just walking. It's very safe to walk everywhere. But the gangs are still there. So what happened? What happened is that they are so organized that the city is very safe because they are basically controlling themselves of perpetrating any kind of violence. So all these between 150 and 450 individual gangs, they are grouped into kind of like 17 bigger groups. And these 17 bigger groups they talk to each other in something like similar to the UN, which is very crazy, which is called La Oficina de Envigado. And basically, it's not really a group. So when people say Oficina de Envigado, no, it's not really a criminal group. It's more like a negotiation space for the big groups of Medellin. And there are many things that we have observed through research that go in that negotiation space, but the most important things is first, any kind of problem that can produce violence among them. So if one of the smaller gangs in Medellin has an issue with another gang in Medellin and they are about to be violent between themselves, what typically happens is that the issue move upwards in the chain, in the hierarchy, and if it's big enough, it goes into this negotiation table. And at the end, they try to discuss it and typically put like some fines on some of them, or they resolve it on some way that is not violent. And you will say, why? Well, again, the reason is they learned that violence is so costly for their business. So at the end, they have created all these institutions, criminal institutions, in order to avoid violence. And that is very successful in terms of the business. So
that's amazing. So this is like, it reminds me of the Cosa Nostra in New York City, like these 5 families that would come together and all disputes would be settled at the table. And this seems like an interesting method. And yeah, I can understand why you use the term maturity there, because they understand that actually the reason that they exist is financial, right? There's a monetary gain and they might as well prioritize the monetary gain. And then infighting just kind of reduces your fighting population, your business people, right? Like your businessmen, the number actually goes down. And then of course you can't really sell drugs if you're engaged in an active war. So this is quite an interesting thing. So then presumably you couldn't have rebel groups operating in a city, because it would be like an anathema for a government in an urban area to have a highly visible group that is trying to actively overthrow the government. So it seems like the groups that are able to be domesticated in the sense that you're using it are ones which will only have a financial incentive. And I guess one last point to tack on is, one thing that you say about Pablo Escobar kind of historically is, one would think, or it almost seems counterintuitive, that if you have one dominant force, I would expect there to be almost more peace, right? And then the fracturing into so many groups, I would expect more chaos. So how did that historically work out as well?
Yeah, indeed. I think your intuition is right, kind of like, because indeed, also in Medellin is a very nice, let's say, lab, if you want to understand crime, of course, with all the costs for the city that has had, right? But the things like Medellin has gone through everything. So because of that, it's a very nice example of every kind of like theory that we have about like how criminal dynamics work. So this idea of like whether one specific leader and the monopoly of one specific leader over the whole city could be more peaceful or not, indeed, that's true, and that already happened. But it was not Pablo Escobar, because Pablo Escobar, the thing is like, he's the biggest name around the world, of course, but basically he created the modern idea of international drug trafficking, right? But he was not that interested into governing the city, because he was more interested into international drug trafficking, right? And he and his criminal colleagues, basically, they are famous is because they were the ones that created most of the modern routes of drug trafficking between South America and the United States. Now, in terms of the city, what happened is that around the beginning of this century, at the beginning of the 2000s, basically there was this leader that indeed was the former driver of Pablo Escobar, but yeah, so basically he was part of the initial crew, let's say, right? But and his name is Don Berna. Basically, he went piece by piece in Medellin, and just through fire was able to conquer all the criminal gangs in Medellin. So he basically set up a whole monopoly over the whole city. And it was so strong, and like all the rules that he set up and everything was so strong that that period is called Gobernabilidad. Because from the word in Spanish, gobernabilidad, that means governance, and Don Berna, that was his name. But what is amazing is that Medellin during the 90s, basically there was like at one year, I remember which year, but there was a homicide rate of more than 400, which is huge. But if you see the graph of homicides in the city, it goes below 80 or something like that in just 1 or 2 years during this period of Don Berna. So he was one of the first one that was first able to put everyone together under the same umbrella in the city, but it was through fire, basically, so everyone was just afraid of him. But it worked if we are seeing this from the lenses of reducing homicides, reducing violence. Now, what is the issue with that? The issue is that those kind of, let's say, equilibriums are very unstable. And that is exactly what happened in Medellin. Once Don Berna was arrested and extradited to the US, hell arose in Medellin. Of course, because if you now don't have the head that is controlling everyone, who is going to succeed him, right? And that was the question in Medellin, and that created what now is called the war between Sebastián and Valenciano that were basically his successors. So basically the two lieutenants of this very big drug lord, they did not agree who was the next leader, and basically two factions were created in the city and war exploded. And it's one of the most bloody wars we have had in Medellin. It lasted like 3 years. All the criminal gangs were involved. So that shows that, yes, homicides is a way to show whether, like, a city in this case is like in a good or bad situation. It's not a perfect measure because during Don Berna we have low homicide rate, but of course drug trafficking was all over the place. But these type of equilibriums are very unstable. It depends on one person.
I love this. Particularly the like socialist anarchist in me is very happy with the idea of redundancy in localized power structures. Because this is interesting because you have a very anarchic structure in the idea of a centralized organization but decentralized power. Mm-hmm. And that's basically what you're describing, right? Which is there's always a problem when power is itself centralized, because once you have a vacuum, then people compete for it. But if any one of these 150 to 450 gangs disappears overnight, there isn't really so much else that the others can do. They can just gobble up that, 150th of the space of the city. So that ends up being quite an interesting thing. So can you now kind of go into what Medellin's government's role is in this?
Of course. And just to say something about what you just mentioned, because that let me think about like how the current arrangement in Medellin is kind of similar to the check and balances that we have in democracy. You know, it's kind of crazy, but it's kind of true, right? Like these 17 big groups kind of like balance each other. That was something that we didn't have during the Don Berna period before. Now, the role of Medellin's government, well, it has also changed throughout the history, of course, because the criminal dynamics have also changed during the history. But let's say that there are like basically 2 or 3 periods of history. The first one is basically during the 90s. The government tried to negotiate with like many of these criminal organizations, but indeed that was not useful, because at the end what happened is that they created some kind of like civilian like surveillance groups, and indeed many people think that idea of like basically it was giving some of these criminal members a role of being the ones in charge of the security of their own neighborhoods, or something like that. And many people studying Colombian history think that is the beginning of the paramilitaries in Colombia, basically. And so that means, if we believe that is true, that will mean that paramilitaries indeed were born from a negotiation between the government and criminal actors in Medellin, which is, of course, something you don't like. It's not a good outcome of a negotiation between the state and criminal actors. So that is one part. Then we have during the beginning of the 2000s a pacification period. It was with Don Berna too. At the same time, in Colombia, we had Álvaro Uribe Vélez is the right-wing leader in Colombia still. He was the president during 8 years in Colombia between 2002 and 2010. And he's still a political leader in Colombia of the right wing. But basically, he's the one in charge of like the military defeat of the FARC, the main guerrilla group in the rural areas of Colombia. So that was happening at the same time. So that was basically a pacification type of a period, and also negotiations with the paramilitaries at the national level. But now, currently, I will say that now we are in a period in which the equilibrium is kind of like, let's be soft with each other kind of thing, Basically, most of the new administrations in Medellin have learned that they are not the ones in charge of the neighborhoods, I will say. So basically, if you are a mayor in Medellin, you need to accept that these groups already are there. Of course, this is not something politically correct to say for them. They don't say it, but that is the feeling that I have, that it's like we in some way need to live with them. And that has created some kind of arrangements that are kind of, let's say, useful in terms of reduced homicides. As I was saying, now Medellin is a very touristy city, very safe city. So it means that it's working. Basically, the arrangements is like, if you are peaceful, if you don't commit homicides, we are fine with you. So we are fine with you selling drugs in the corner or whatever you other things do, if it's not affecting the community, So it's kind of a red line approach in which the mayor typically just interfere when there is something specifically that is kind of like out of some kind of boundaries and affecting too much the residents of the Medellin. However, let's say that the current mayor is a new mayor. He started last year. Is a mayor that is repeating. Is his second term, but he was the mayor in 2016. There was another left-wing mayor after him, and now is the mayor again. And he's a right-wing, and he's more an iron fist guy, which is something that is happening throughout all Latin America. Basically, now most of the politicians are deciding to engage with criminal actors from a policy perspective, like policing more like with police, with iron fists, with like that mano dura, we say in Spanish, kind of like thing. So if that is going to work or not, at this point, I don't think we have enough data for Medellin at least, because again, criminal actors are different in each city, but we have a lot of evidence that this approach has a lot of issues in other places in the world, including El Salvador, etc.
Yeah, this is a concerning thing because you have a lot of stability, and obviously, I'm not advocating for the existence of gangs, right? But then to try to defeat them by force seems like a very violent outcome for everyone involved, right? And usually civilians get caught in this crossfire all the time. And we see what happens with, raids in cities. We just saw one in Rio, right, which was extremely deadly. So how to deal with this? I mean, how do you see it progressing?
Yeah, well, there are many ways to try to deal with criminal actors. However, the first thing I would like to say is that, of course, there is no a silver bullet. Of course, the first reason for that is because every actor is different, right? So, for example, now in El Salvador, they have Bukele, who is a very iron fist president, basically is like putting everyone in jail. And yeah, there is evidence that has diminished homicides, extortion, and everything. Of course, with that cost, mainly in terms of human rights, right? So there is here a discussion that we as a society need to have in order, to decide how much are we willing to give up in terms of security, right? Like, are we willing to give up our liberties, our human rights, or not, right? But beyond that is a point we can discuss further. I'm not sure whether what works in El Salvador could work in any other part of the world, because of course criminal groups are different. They react differently to any kind of thing that you try to do against them. In the case of, for example, Medellin, an iron fist policy there, I'm not sure whether it can work or not, is because just those criminal institutions that I was described, those specific arrangements that make criminal actors to talk to each other, and all those things can make the iron fist policy even more deadly, because now you are not tackling a bunch of disaggregated criminal actors. They can react to this together against you, which can be really, really bad, right? So again, iron fist policies it's like I heard once a colleague saying like sometimes using iron fist policies like chemotherapy, you don't treat a cold with chemotherapy. It's kind of like that because chemotherapy has a lot of cost for the body. So if you have a mild flu, you don't give the chemotherapy to that person, right? So the appropriate medicine for the appropriate problem, I will say. But we can discuss beyond other approaches that I think have been tried in other places of the world that are not Iron Fist. However, Iron Fist, of course, is the main issue now because it's what is spreading more in Latin America and also I think also in the US right now too, and even in Europe. Like I have heard now also in Europe this idea that you need to deal with criminal actors just using by basically prisons, and that's it.
Yeah, it'd be nice to go into the different means that governments have used to kind of try to dismantle organized crime. But before that, I would like to kind of go into the services that the gangs are providing. Because in Medellin also, with an Iron Fist policy, like you said, there is, because you have this table where they all are able to sit around, you'd give them a common enemy, and then they could unite, and then you have, you're basically facing one gang, right? They'll be flying at least one banner. And there's also the issue of, if they're providing services, I kind of want to get a sense of how good these services are that they're providing, what the average citizen of Medellin thinks about the services and their perception of the gangs. Because if the government actually takes out the gangs and they are not an effective government, then when they take out the gangs, the citizens of Medellin are also losing the services that are provided. So to what extent are they intermediaries of government services, and to what extent are they providing services which wouldn't otherwise be there?
Well, yeah, that is a good question. And the first thing to put into context here is that Medellin is indeed a very successful city in terms of serving their own citizens. And this is something that maybe a lot of people is not used to. When you hear about like a city that has more than at least 100 gangs, you think like, okay, that place is kind of hell. But again, it's not like that. And indeed, an example of that is that Medellin is known as the miracle of Latin America, just because after in the 90s having like this huge homicides rate, now is one of the technological hubs in Latin America and is very well known for that. And that comes also with a huge variety of services that are provided by the city, the government. So it's a city in which the vast majority, I will say, I don't have the numbers, but I will say the vast majority of citizens have like access to water, access to electricity, access to internet. If you go to Medellin, you will see a lot of public infrastructure, etc. So a lot of people are surprised when I tell them, like, at the same time we are living together here with like more than 100 criminal gangs. The first thing to understand is that even in a city like that, like Medellin, and I think in any big city in the world, like even Paris, London, or whatever, services, even strong governments, are not able to provide services equally throughout the city. So it's not that all the city is being served equally. Indeed, I have an example from here, like here in Vienna, and Vienna is the second most livable city in the world. And I think it is, and one of the reasons is because of the huge access to services that we have here. However, I live in Favoriten. Favoriten is the migrant district, and access to health there is way harder than in the rest of the city. So even in cities like this one, it's not true that the city's governments provide services equally. So that's just as a context. Now, in terms of the quality of the service that these gangs provide, well, it varies a lot again. It depends whether this gang is in one of these spaces in which the state is not really reaching there. That in the Medellin area is typically in the periphery of the city. In these areas, there is a space to provide even water sometimes, because the vast majority of people have water. But if you live in the border of the city, most of the neighborhoods there are slums, as they are called. I don't like to call them like that, but basically these are neighborhoods where people don't have papers about from their houses, So they are just building in typically state lands. Because of that, access to water is not allowed because these are lands that don't come with access to water or electricity. So in those areas, typically they provide water. Basically what they do is that they dig a very deep hole and they get the access from there, and they control who can get access to that water or not, charging typically like a fixed fee weekly or something like that. And electricity, what they do is like that they typically use illegal wires connecting to surrounding areas that have electricity and basically provide electricity to that specific area. Now Medellin has a lot of projects to try to give access to water and electricity to those neighborhoods. They're aiming to, like displace this control that these criminal actors have. But still, they provide some other services that are kind of like less tangible, I would say. For example, security is one, of course. Security from whom? Well, of course, from theirs is one thing, but also from others. Because even in a place as controlled by criminals like Medellin, there are still some petty criminals. So, things like that. That includes, for example, beatings to anyone who is consuming drugs nearby a school. That means if there is a sexual assault, typically they beat that person and they find their family or things like that. So security is a big issue. And the other one that is kind of like, typically we don't talk that much about those type of services, but is dispute resolution. And you have to think that this is a very dense city. If you go to one of these neighborhoods, the houses are very, very tight together. And typically in spaces like that, there are a lot of disputes among neighbors, sorry. Like my neighbor is building a new floor and now I have a leak in my roof, things like that. So, and that is a service that it should be provided by the state, dispute resolution, but in most of these areas, these processes are very bureaucratic and very slow. So what is faster? You just go to the closest gang member and tell them, this neighbor is like making this, and because of that, I have a leak on my roof. And they come and they typically solve the dispute in some way that, of course, I'm not going to say it's just or unbiased, but they solve the dispute, So that is another service I typically provide. Now, what typically people think about those services? Well, indeed, we conducted a survey a couple of years ago. I think it was the first round was in 2019 and the second round in 2020, asking people about that. Basically, what services are being offered by these criminal actors, the quality of the services, and what they think about these criminal actors. And most of these people are really happy. Basically, when you ask them, how do you think your neighborhood will be without them? Most of people say worst, not better. Yeah, so that is a big signal that people are kind of happy like that. But of course, because the counterfactual here is just go to the state service because they exist. But first, it's not in your neighborhood. Probably you need to go to downtown or whatever. Second, you need to make a line for 6 hours. It's a very long bureaucratic process. It's going to last 6 months. And at the end, they are not going to solve it, So at the end, it's very hard for the state to compete with that. The other thing that is just a funny anecdote is that Colombia is the second country in the world with most holidays. So yeah, we typically have a lot of holidays, and people typically don't work that much in December because it's Christmas the whole month. So typically everything is kind of a stop. So if you are doing anything, especially with the government, you need to do it before December, or it's just postponed to the next year. And we were doing it with some researchers from the US. And they were not used to that, of course. And we were like, okay, December is coming. We need to rush things up because otherwise until January. And they were like, how is the state gonna be able to compete with these guys if the state is basically working for 11 months while these guys are here 24/7? They are your neighbor. Literally, they live next to you. So there are things like that too to consider.
Yeah, there's also the fact that centralized bureaucracy can be very violent, right? Not physically violent, but psychologically violent, right? In the neglect. So you have this problem of, I guess, or this situation where the gangs are actually alleviating the neglect of underserved communities. And I think that that's, an incredibly valuable service. But you also mentioned one thing about repercussions against someone who commits sexual assault. So this might be a difficult question because I don't know if you have the figures on it, but are they, maybe to provide context, can you explain how the police engage with gangs when they sort of start warring? Can you explain that process of how the police almost tamed the violence between gangs? Because then also my question is, do the gangs sort of develop a way to self-enforce nonviolence? But does this extend to violence against women? I mean, can you say that women are generally more safe when you have this localized sort of organization stopping violence against women? It might be, I know that might be out of the purview, so feel free to just not have an answer for that. But yeah, what does that look like?
Well, yeah, of course. First, it's not a topic I have engaged that much with. However, in many of my interviews, talking with residents or even with gang members, like typically the sexual violence against women typically is something that comes up. Why? Because Colombia is a very misogynistic culture. We have very high numbers. I don't know the numbers, but I know they are very high in terms of like violence against women. And indeed, we are one of the very few countries in the world that we have a specific definition of a homicide against a woman that is called feminicide in our law, like in our rules, basically. It's basically something you can be charged of. However, yes, that's good, but even though that means that we need it because violence against women is very high, right? And especially, I will say, the area of Medellin is one of the areas that is more misogynistic in Colombia, indeed. Like, it's a very conservative area. They valued a lot conservative traditional values, traditional families, things like that. And that brings a lot of like this too. Now, in terms of sexual violence, what typically happens is that you need to consider that most of these criminal actors come from the same communities they are governing. They were born there. They were raised there. They are basically, their relatives are there. Their friends are there. And that creates a space in which, of course, if you are assaulting a woman, it's very likely that I know that woman. It's very likely that or she's my relative or she's my friend or we went to the school together. So at this point, I wouldn't say that the criminal actors are fair and basically they have the flag of like fighting against violence against women or something like that. No, I think it's more a personal kind of thing because of the proximity that they have with the whole community. Also, there is a demand for that. So if an assault happens in one of these neighborhoods and the criminal gang doesn't do anything, the neighbors are going to complain with the gang. And they are going to say, why are you not doing anything? So it's expected that they do anything, and because of that, they have to do it. So I think it's more, it doesn't come from a place of really favoring feminist cause or something like that. It comes from a place of how embedded these criminal actors are in the society and the push that they receive from the community now that they are have the role of being the leaders. So now they have to solve that.
Yeah, and this is one of the classic cases of how you can get a very similar outcome regardless whether you have an ideological driver or a structural driver. And here you have a structural driver where they happen to just know each other. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the common problems with policing in general, in that police can get moved from community to community in the United States, from state to state. And if they commit violence, in the unjustified violence, any violence against the body is unjustified in my opinion, but if they commit violence and they're found guilty, instead of being sort of removed from the police force, they just get moved to a new state. So then they're moved to where they even know even less people. And then I think the chances of them being afraid and committing violence is even higher. So here you have a situation where the effective policing force is a very local force, albeit ungoverned loosely in a sense, but something where familiarity can kind of breed restraint.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but now I'm thinking that someone can ask, okay, so maybe let's get closer the police to the communities that they are serving, right? And indeed, that is something that is an approach that is very common in like public policy security literature. That is the idea of like the police is kind of too disconnected to the communities that they are serving, so maybe let's put them together. And indeed, many places have tried that, and Colombia tried that. Several years ago, we changed the structure of our police, and basically what we did is that we created a specific mini police stations. Basically, these are police stations in which typically they are between 4 to 6 police officers serving, so it's very, very small, tiny, and it's not the same as the neighborhood, but it's very close. So let's say that is like a mini police station by neighborhood, something like that. And the idea was that it's like, let's bring together the police, because if they know the community better, they know their needs, they are going to do their job better, right? But there are some backlashes that can bring, indeed, of course, because again, criminal actors are in these communities. What happens if the police spends more time creating connections with a community in which criminal actors also are present? Corruption, right? Like you are given space for that too. So iterated interactions between police and communities are good, but one of the main things that I have learned in what I do is that any kind of public policy that you can imagine can bring something negative, and you need to think in advance of what are the potential backlashes of what I'm doing now.
And so can you explain what happens because when I think about a gang, outside of this conversation, I think about an entity that is using violence as capital, right? That is one of the enforcement mechanisms. That is how they secure their existence. But here you have a situation where the gangs are actually deprioritizing their use of violence as their medium, right? The justification for their existence. Can you explain how the police engages with gangs? Say you have 2 gangs in rival neighborhoods that start fighting. What does the government do?
Well, that happens now way less frequent, of course, because all these criminal institutions are in place in order to avoid violence, right, between them. But when it happens, what typically happens is that the police targets one of them. And typically it's the weakest one, right? That's the approach. Of course, if you target the weakest one, that means that first, you are most likely to succeed. And second, maybe it's going to be faster. So at the end, you're going to solve the problem. So I would say that's how violence is used. But now this idea that criminal actors move away from violence again because they learned about the cost of violence to the business that they are running, and is exactly the reason why they are doing all these other things. Because coercion is typically the main tool that criminal actors have in order to survive, right? But what happens when you have a strong state, or relatively strong state, that is still able to do something against you if they decide to do it? That is what's happening in Medellin, right? Like, it's a space in which we have a ton of criminal actors, but if the state targets one, that criminal actor is in trouble. So that idea is the reason for trying to move away from violence towards all these, let's say, more peaceful kind of strategies of survival. In this case, gaining legitimacy among the community, right? So that is kind of like what is happening here.
And you would explain that when, say, 2 gangs also start engaging in violence, the police, sometimes instead of just fighting back, they'll just put a bunch of police on the corners that they sell drugs. And that seems to prove pretty effective, because then they just stop the drug trade, they feel it in their wallets, and then they just say, okay, fine, we won't actually do this.
Yeah, indeed. And that is an approach. It's called deterrence. Basically, it's an approach that has been used in many places in the world. Indeed, many police forces in the world use it without even knowing the approach, because it's kind of like a very natural way for the police to work. And it has shown some positive results in many places, and is the idea of basically using red lines or drawing red lines for criminal actors to work. So again, it's this idea of like, okay, it's very hard to fight against them. If I fight them, the city is going to be very violent. So I don't want that. And I'm not sure whether arresting the leader is going to be better or not, because again, arresting the leader can cause like another fight between lieutenants or something like that. So another approach is what they have been doing in Medellin. I think they did it in Chicago. They did it in New York at some point, in Rio de Janeiro. That is, okay, these criminal actors do some things that are very bad. Homicides is the main one. Sometimes extortion is the second one. But they do some other things that they are harmful, but not that harmful. Like selling drugs, Of course, some people will say selling drugs is very harmful. Yes, but here the comparison is that versus a homicide, So if we are balancing out, like at the end, the idea is that we are going towards a lower number of homicides, maybe we need to allow some other things to happen. So the idea is like, okay, you cannot commit a homicide. If you commit a homicide, I'm going to put all my police force in your corner during 1 month. And during that month, you cannot sell drugs. Of course, that is very harmful for you because you depend on that corner and the drugs you are selling there to survive. So the idea is that you train the criminal actors bit by bit doing that. And at some point they learned, maybe we shouldn't commit homicides. But of course, the thing here is that you need to give them some leeway, because otherwise they are going to react very violently towards you. And the leeway typically is allowing some other minor crimes, or let's say minor in the sense of like less violent crimes, to occur. And typically it's drug selling. So whether people are willing to do that or not, that is more like a debate about the position of drugs in our society, I will say. But at least in places like Medellin, that is typically what happens. Most of the police force in Medellin, they don't go after drugs, because at the end they are being sold everywhere. But if a homicide is occurred, or if a tourist is assaulted or something like that, you are going to have 20 police officers in that corner for 1 month. So that's why the criminal actors are domesticated. And that's why for tourists going to Medellin, it feels so safe, because it's true. It's never is going to happen. They know that if they do something to someone like that, it's very bad news for them.
So I guess the government isn't saying explicitly that they have an arrangement with the gangs, right? So how do they do this?
Exactly. Yeah, like most of the times these approaches don't work with an explicit agreement. And that's why I'm saying most of the police forces use it without even knowing about the approach. Because it's a very natural way to work, especially because police forces are scarce resources. Typically, you need to prioritize. And if you have homicides and other types of crimes, typically you prioritize homicides over other types of crimes, right? Because you cannot deal with everything at the same time. So here the example is, this is like training a dog. The dog doesn't understand your words. So you can tell them, this is what is going to happen, but the dog is not understanding what you're saying. But the dog understands about positive and negative reinforcements. That's basically the idea. So a negative reinforcement is sending the police to crack down a corner if you commit a homicide. And the positive reinforcement is don't doing anything else if you're within the boundaries that I kind of drawing. So that is the idea at the end.
And I also want to get a sense of when internally for the police force, say, or with the government, they're building these types of policies. Presumably they're not writing anything down, right? I mean, would you expect, I know this is not exactly what you're looking at, but would you expect that there's a bunch of internal memos, right? Like sent from the mayor to the police chief, and where they actually have explicit conversations? Or is it more like, you deal with it as the police, we're going to pretend like we don't know what's going on?
Well, if there are memos like that, I would love to see them, because it would be very great for my research, It would be real data that I can use. It depends, of course. In some places, these approaches have been kind of like formalized. Before Bukele in El Salvador, it was kind of like that, because the Salvadorian government and the gangs were negotiating. So between the negotiation, in that time, that was kind of like what was happening. And indeed, in most of the periods of negotiation between criminal actors and governments, that is what typically happens, because again, you need to give them some leeway in order to keep them on the table, right? But even when these arrangements are not formal, which is the biggest case, of course, there are some signals that you can see that this is happening. In Medellin, for example, there are some colleagues of mine that are studying. There was this kind of like increase in violence happening in Medellin, not as high as in the 90s, but a little bit high, like 6 years ago or something like that. And there was, coincidentally, let's say, a movement in most of the, I will say first that most of the criminal gangs in Medellin are, their bosses are in prison. So indeed, like most of the orders come from prison to the streets, right? Now, what happened and what my colleagues are studying is something very interesting, and is that there was sort of movements of prison inmates in Colombia, because many of these criminal leaders are in other prisons in Colombia. And so they were moving guy A to another prison and guy B to another prison. And coincidentally, all of them had to spend a couple of nights in the same prison, in one prison in Colombia. And after that, what my colleagues are studying, there was a big drop in homicides in the city. So here, again, is indirect evidence, but what we are seeing is that when they had a space to apparently interact with each other, that's what happened. And this was allowed by the government, because apparently the government was moving them in order to make them talk. There are other kind of instances like that. Indeed, the former Secretary of Security of Medellin, in 2016, he was arrested because he was negotiating with criminal actors, but not in the way you could think. It was not about corruption. The thing is, like in Colombia, the only government body that is allowed to negotiate with criminal actors is the national government. And this was the Secretary of Security of Medellin, which is a local government. So he was not allowed to do that. It was not about corruption. It was more about going over the limitations of his role. The thing is, like, he was negotiating because apparently, I don't remember the case very properly, but it was about finding a car that was stolen in some part of Medellin. And apparently he was intermediating with some criminal actors to get information from them about who stole the car and get it faster. So he was trying to do his job, to solve a crime but it was through the criminal actors. So that was why he's arrested. So these are some kind of like indirect ways in which you can see how the state is interested in giving these spaces. But of course, they cannot do, because first, it's illegal in the Colombian legal framework, but also is politically costly, of course.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. It's interesting that the national government wouldn't see that the local politicians, right, or people who are public servants wouldn't have a better sense of what's going on in their individual city. So it's strange that they sort of have this policy. But what does that come from? Is it sort of historically built in, or?
Well, my guess is that it comes first. Colombia is a very centralized country in terms of the government. And that is because of historic reasons, basically federalism versus centralism, things like that. So the power is very, very concentrated in this national government and in Bogota, in the capital city. So that's one thing. The other thing I will say, and typically this is the same idea that comes in debates when we are talking about decentralization projects, like giving more power to local governments. And it's the idea that many of these local governments are first or unable to perform their responsibilities because of they don't have the people able to do that, they don't have the skills, things like that. But the second one is another argument, I'm not saying that I agree with it, but it's the argument that typically these people have, that is most of these governments are already co-opted by criminal actors, not just like the ones in Medellin, but like, the guerrillas, the paramilitaries, or other actors. And that means that if you give them more independence, more resources, or even the authorization to negotiate, there is this risk that criminal actors are co-opting them, and because of that, it wouldn't be really a negotiation. It will be more like some kind of like auto-negotiation between the criminal actor and someone who is already in their under their budget, kind of.
Right. So the corruption risk, they see the corruption risk as being higher, which is, okay, I see. And so can we also historically take a quick look at what happens? Because also Colombia has like a big history of rebel groups, right? And I guess centralization in governments is really important, because then, you don't allow them to take over autonomous regions or things like that. But what was the situation with FARC's sort of collapse, essentially? I mean, can you paint a picture of what we're going into in Colombia from kind of the 80s and 90s to present day?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. Like for those who don't know, basically that now that we are talking about centralization and this kind of debate of independence of other regions from the national government, basically that is the reason why FARC as a guerrilla group was born. And indeed, probably some of the other guerrilla groups too. It was basically that our government is too centralized, and basically they don't hear that much the needs of the other regions of the country, right? So that was the main reason. Then basically, I will say they just grew up throughout the whole 20th century, second half of 20th century, and the first breaking point for them was again this Álvaro Uribe Vélez presidency, that is again this right-wing leader at the beginning of the 2000s that is still a political leader in Colombia, because basically he was the one that put a lot of resources and focus into target the guerrillas. And it was an iron fist policy, of course. It was just like bombardments and things like that in order to defeat them militarily, as they were saying. That was the goal of his whole presidency. And indeed, that is the reason why he became so popular in the country, because it was the first time that many people felt that the guerrilla groups were really receding and kind of like losing the war. Other than that, we were just like seeing infinite civil war in the country that was never about to end. So after that, basically that defeat, then comes Santos, our president, who won the Peace Nobel Prize because of the agreement with the FARC. So that was 2016, right? Now, I will say, for people interested in that, the most important part is what is happening since the agreement until now. The agreement was signed in 2016. It was a very, complete agreement based on what researchers and experts have said. It was kind of like a divisive agreement too. It lost a plebiscite. Basically, half of the country was against signing the agreement, and half of the country was in agreement with the agreement. So at the end, it's a very divisive debate in Colombia on how to deal with criminal actors, in this case, rebel actors, right? Now, the issue is that first, the agreement hasn't been implemented as it should be because of several reasons. First is that after the agreement was signed, the next president was a right-wing leader who was opposed to the agreement. And what researchers have said is that he was not that much into implementing the agreement. And then it came the pandemic too, which of course hit everything. And now we have kind of like another breaking point. We have a left-leaning president, which we supposed he was very eager to implement the agreement, but he's more focused into what he called total peace. Basically, the idea that now we have to negotiate with all the other actors that are still present in Colombia. So he's trying to reach this, to create negotiation tables with these other actors. But because of that, he hasn't been able to implement that much. And of course, if you have an agreement, but you are not implementing it, of course, it's just on paper, right? Like, it's not fair to say that it's just in paper. Of course, Colombia has seen a lot of positive things from that, like homicides rates decrease a lot in many places of Colombia, etc. But I have to say that it's an incomplete pace, I think. And especially from the criminal actor side, what happened is that the FARC basically were extracted from these territories that they were controlling for decades. But now there are other actors entering because the state didn't occupy that space. The idea was to implement the agreement in order to occupy that space, not just with military or security, right? But with health, education, social programs, land tenure assignment, things like that. But that didn't happen as fast as it was supposed to happen. And because of that, all the other criminal actors or rebel actors present in Colombia basically occupy that space. So we have now another period of our history in which I think no one will say that we are still in a civil war. I think that is not the correct term anymore, but we still have a bunch of criminal actors that are controlling, governing, and performing violence in many territories of Colombia.
Oh man, that's really upsetting, because you have infrastructure where you can almost imagine a situation where they just then institutionalize and hire the people in FARC who are there, to provide those services. But then the money comes from the government rather than, through violence and dominance. But it seems like an immense missed opportunity. But hopefully it's kind of progressing in a way where there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. But
well, we have elections next year, so it depends a lot on that too, right? Like who is in charge of the country, if that person is going to implement or not the agreement, how are they going to deal with the other actors that are not part of the agreement. And we are coming back here to the Iron Fist debate again, because this is the main hot topic in many places in the world. And what I'm seeing now is that most of the current pre-candidates in this election race, presidential race, they are basically saying like, we will implement the agreement, but Iron Fist to the other ones. Is that kind of approach that if that is going to work, I don't know, it's difficult to deal with those kind of approaches at the same time, right? Like basically, as we say, carrot and stick is not even carrot and stick. It's more like, it's a very difficult approach to deal with. So it depends on that.
Is there any movement, say, to the left of Petro's government that says, oh yeah, we actually want to implement and also sign new agreements?
Well, I think on the left, there is always this idea that the agreements are very important. And of course, all of them, all the left leaders, political leaders in Colombia, they supported the agreement and everything. Here again, the question is whether they are going to prioritize it or not. And instead of like prioritizing other, of course, we have so many issues that it's hard to prioritize, but that is the issue right now. Like Petro is not prioritizing the agreement that is signed. He's prioritizing creating new agreements. Now, I will say, there are many left leaders who think that the agreement is not working is because it's not being implemented. Whether they are going to do it, if they are elected, I don't know. Petro say that during his campaign, and then he suddenly say like, no, but we need more agreements with others. So, it's hard to say at this point.
So can we also now shift it to you a little bit, because you're researching gangs and you're going to Medellin. What is it like for safety for you when you're actually doing this research?
That is a very I will say that is a question that typically I expect more people asking, and we don't think that much in academia or in research about those things. Typically, I receive the question of how do you get access to interviewing criminal actors? So more people are interested on that. Not that many people are interested on how safe do you feel? Yes, and I think it's because of one reason. It's like, for people not familiarized, we in academia have these ethical standards, that they are very important because they ensure that if you are researching people, like you have human subjects are there. So if you are researching humans and even sometimes animals, you need to treat them with dignity, right? So it's these ethical standards in order to ensure the safety and the basically respect toward the participants of your research. However, those guidelines don't include researchers, which is very interesting, right? Like, because of course it's very important to ensure that we as researchers are thinking on how to respect our subjects and keep them safe, but what about us? So in my case, well, I wouldn't say that I don't feel insecure, but of course I try to take most of the measures that I can for that. So typically first, every time that I go to a place, I go with someone is introducing me. I don't cold visit any place. It would be kind of like awkward and very dangerous to go to a neighborhood that is controlled by a criminal actor if you don't know anyone there. So typically I'm introduced to that territory by a community leader or by a resident of that neighborhood, or even sometimes by a former criminal member or something like that. So that is one thing, but the other thing are small measures that we take. Like I text my partner and I say like, I'm entering fieldwork. I cannot use my cell phone during 5 hours. I let you know. And she's like kind of like in charge of like if something happens to do something. And she has the contacts of the people she should call to if I'm not like after 5 hours, I'm not like calling back or something like that. So there are these small measures that you can take. However, of course, it's very hard. I know some very awful stories about people doing research in these topics. Indeed, even under, I was like the supervisor of this survey data collection effort, and a couple of times we have a couple of surveyors that were like into these communities. They were, I wouldn't say kidnapped, but they were not allowed to leave a house during some hours, and they were questioned about what they were doing there, what kind of questions they were like asking in the survey and things like that. And of course, that's very scary. So yes, it's not a very, let's say, safe branch of work, but we do what we can, I think.
Yeah, because if I'm running a gang and I see a survey asking how happy I am with the gang, but then it's interesting because your results, I mean, it's not like, I'm not saying that you're painting a positive picture of gangs, but you're also showing kind of what this peace style, an agreement between government and gangs can actually do that doesn't inflict more harm on the population, at least. Maybe we can put it that way.
Yeah, indeed. Like, again, I don't try to justify criminal actors or anything like that. What I try to do is to portray the most, and it's hard to say objective, but let's say objective image of what I'm observing on the data is saying to me. And many, as I was saying at the beginning of this talk, like many of the times is that criminal actors have some, let's say, positive spillovers over communities that they are governing. And that's why when he did the survey and we asked people how much do they trust in the criminal actor governing their neighborhood, they say it a lot. And who am I to say that that's not true? Like, yeah, of course, it's what they feel. So it's true that a lot of the questions that I ask, typically the answer is not police good, criminal actors are bad. For example, in my dissertation, I found that these criminal actors sometimes decide to make easier the work of the state. So there is some positive aspect in terms of public service delivery that they can have over the communities that they are governing. So someone can say like, okay, so you are saying that they are good. No, indeed, because in the same research, I say that they are not doing it because they are very nice people. I'm saying that they are doing it because it's good for their personal interests and their organization interests, because that is helping them to avoid state enforcement. So, so at the end, I'm not portraying them as good. I'm portraying them as a very selfish organization that happens that some of the things they do are also good for the people that they are governing.
Yeah, I really appreciate that there's a lot of nuance there. I mean, that's the best thing we can provide as academics. It's not just a binary outcome. And when you are kind of reaching out to folks in the community, are you sending an email? Like, what is that? What does that look like, right? Like,
no. I'm not called emailing that. Also, I don't think they will answer. Indeed, I don't think there is a database of emails with gang members. The police maybe have one. I don't know. But, no, indeed, most of the field work that I do, and I think it's the same for a lot of people doing ethnographic work and very field work, rich work. It works through connections. So basically, one person, that person introduces you to another person, it's like that. And that's why it takes that much. For me, it was years and years and years of being in the same city, trying to get access, until finally someone was able to introduce me to one of these gang members, So, of course, because as you could imagine, typically it's very hard to get access to any kind of social network in the sense of a community or something like that and gain their trust. Now imagine a criminal actor. Of course, they have way more to lose if they are talking with an external unknown person like me. So most of that worked through connections, really. In my case, I have been building these connections throughout years. I think it has been now 8 years. And I was able to get in contact with many of these criminal actors to interview them because I was working previously to my PhD in a project interviewing former gang members in prison. And I met many of them there. And also I have colleagues that have created these networks in their personal experiences. And now that they trust me, they are willing to introduce me to their contacts too. And indeed, that is the main thing I will say, because as one of the gang leaders said last year to me when I was interviewing him, I don't trust on you, I trust on the person who brought you. So whatever you do with whatever I'm saying is not on you, it's on him. So, it's like that. It's networks of trust, I will say.
Yeah, right on. And how did you settle on Medellin?
Well, that was kind of random. I'm from Bogota, from the capital of Colombia. But I was working for this organization, helping with research conducted in Bogota about security in Bogota. But at some point, they needed a person to open a new office in Medellin for a new project about criminal gangs in Medellin. And they just asked me whether I will be willing to move there. And I was. Medellin is a great city to live. Again, it's despite all the numbers that I have thrown here, it's a great city to live. Most people that have visited Medellin know this. So it's a great city to live. I lived there for 3 years, helping with this project, and that's why basically I moved there. And then I moved to my PhD, but I still continuously go back to the city because it's when most of my research contacts are based on.
Yeah, and so you're technically based at Yale at the moment, and so the PhD is out of Yale. You're in Vienna at the moment, so you spent a lot of time kind of going back and forth to Colombia. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right on. And so does the situation in the States end up playing a role, like a factor in the work that you've been able to do? I mean, is there a hindrance there, or is it just kind of circumstantial?
Well, I will say that I was kind of in a lucky moment indeed, with all the things happening in the US, because even before everything started, I decided to move to Europe for personal reasons, family reasons, and professional reasons indeed. So indeed, everything caught me here, but I was already planning to be here, so it was kind of like a luck shot from there. Now, of course, there are some difficulties because everything what is happening in the U.S., of course, is the amount of uncertainty that we as scholars are facing. Also, a scholar like me, like I'm a Colombian. I'm also like researching criminal actors in Colombia, in Mexico, things like that. So that creates a lot of uncertainty, and because of that, I'm avoiding coming back to the U.S. for the near future, which of course is very sad in many levels. The first one, professionally, I'm avoiding conferences in the U.S., which is a bad outcome because many of the big conferences in political science are based in the U.S. And indeed, I was talking this morning to a colleague, and we were like saying how now one of the biggest conferences in the U.S. now also have a virtual. Now you can also present virtually. It's the first time that they do that, and I think it's a signal that I'm not the only one that is avoiding engaging with U.S. academia. Also, that means that I'm probably not going to attend my graduation ceremony. And indeed, I had big plans for my family to come there to celebrate with me, but now that's not happening. In terms of, for example, applying to jobs in the U.S., I'm not affected by that. Is because I was not applying in the U.S. because I am a Fulbrighter, and that means that I cannot apply there. But I know many of my colleagues that they are from Latin America or other countries, and they are finishing their PhD in the U.S., and they are not applying in the U.S., or they are applying, but they are being asked for proof of citizenship, which of course means that they are out of the process even before they start. So yeah, it's a very uncertain moment that affects everyone. Even if you think it's not affecting you, it's affecting you in some way, right? In my case, yeah, of course, some flights go through the U.S. to Colombia. So those flights, a little bit, I would like to avoid them too. So
yeah, right on. And so return to the work itself, where do you see this work going? I mean, is there a project that you see sort of moving on from Colombia, or is it that you'd like to actually deepen the understanding in Colombia itself?
No, indeed, I'm broadening my research agenda to other places in the world. Indeed, another part of my work now is based in Mexico. So I'm also like stepping there too. And indeed, more recently, I'm now thinking on new projects in Europe too. I think, of course, criminal dynamics in Europe work differently, of course. But for what I have seen in my time here, I think there are many things that Europe can learn from us in terms of how to deal with these actors, first. And second, in terms, again, of how some public policies can have unintended effects. So I'm now creating some projects in terms of like understanding how, for example, some connections between migration here in Europe and criminal organizations can basically create unintended consequences of restricting the mobility of migrants. So at the end, restricting more migrants probably is gonna give some strength to criminality networks that benefit from these restrictions, right? Like by human trafficking or things like that. So I'm now kind of stepping into Europe. I think, again, there are some knowledge that we can bring from areas, because of course Latin America has a large experience on dealing with this problem. So I think Europe can learn from that. But of course, I'm also learning about Europe and like how these dynamics can be shaped also in different economic and social environment. So I'll say that.
Yeah, and why do you do the work that you do?
Wow, that's a very good question, and it's the first time that someone asks me that. Well, I think we research what we are affected by. I always have thought how a lot of the research in, for example, rebels or conflict or civil wars come from places like Colombia. Because, of course, we have a bunch of researchers that grew up seeing that, right? directly or indirectly. Like another example is the vast majority of, or a large bunch of the best macroeconomists in the world are Argentinians because of the levels of inflation that they have there. Like that, and that is part of our nature, of course. Like we grow up with some problems that we observe, and we want to understand them and maybe try to solve them, right? In my case, I grew up in a neighborhood in Bogota that was affected by crime. So crime was like observing crime around me was a part of my childhood. And then my teen years too. So I would say that I always lived around it, surrounded by it. So I always was interested in this idea of why some people decide to do that, decide to, like to assault someone else or to rob or to things like that. So for me, it was kind of natural when I came into my master's and I took this class in the economics of crime, and it was like click, like, oh, this is the answer that a part of me was like asking myself for years and years because of why I observed during my whole childhood around me. And then it was natural, just like continuously asking myself, but now using research methods and everything in order to understand that a little bit more. And I hope that my insights can help a little bit to solve some of these issues, right? So yeah, I think it's the context and the background who shapes ourselves as researchers.
Yeah, and so there's kind of an ideal outcome for the work, which is not only your own understanding, but then hopefully the betterment of the people living in situations that are where criminal violence is a regular part of daily life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course, there are other things to consider, right? Like one is the intention. In my case, the intention or like the motivation to know or to understand the social phenomena that I observed. But the other one is the obstacles that you face and having the resources for it, right? Like why some other countries suffering civil wars don't have that, like Sudan. Well, because there is no this whole academic, institutional space for people to be able to do it, right? So they could have the intention because, of course, they will be interested in solving the issue. But if you don't give them the resources or like the space to be able to do it, they cannot. In Colombia, typically people say of us that we are a very specific case because we are a country that has suffered a lot of violence, criminality, things like that. But at the same time, we are very modern and kind of developed in many ways. So it's a very strange combination. You have both. You have the issues that motivate people to research that. But at the same time, you have very good universities, very good data indeed. Like we have amazing data. I have these many colleagues that are not from Colombia that when they see our data of violence, they are like, wow, we will love to have that in any other place. So that a couple of things together is what makes at the end able to have a great pool of researchers doing that, right? Like other than that, like it's impossible.
Yeah, and feel free to, if there's anything else you want to touch on, we can shift to that as well. But I guess the last thing I would put to you, unless you have another thing you want to say, is it seems like so much of the situation in Latin America with organized crime is because of the attempted hegemony of the United States, right? And you have all these economic factors, the fact that it's the biggest drug market, and there's a lot of facilitation and even goading of the United States into for autocrats, arming of groups, etc. So, do you also sort of contextualize the work in that?
Well, I'm not that much into, let's say, international political economy, or basically that is like studying how international dynamics work, right? And they affect these characteristics. Indeed, most of my work is at the micro level because I'm very interested into people's stories. So that's why I like I'm an economist by my bachelor and my master's, but I decided to go also into ethnography because I love hearing people telling me their stories. So that's why I focus in the micro level dynamics. Now, what you are saying, I think it's fair to say that a lot of these issues that we have in Latin America about criminal actors and violence, they are related to our relationship with the US, of course. And even if I'm not an expert, it's part of our debates constantly. And it goes in different ways. Like, of course, as you were saying, the US is the main drug consumer in the world. So for us, having the characteristics to produce the drugs, of course, is kind of like a bad combination for us. But in the other way, like Mexico is suffering violence also in part because of the lack of regulation of firearms in the US. And a lot of those firearms go into Mexico. And because of that, the levels of the type of violence that is observed now in Mexico and the levels of lethality of the arms that are using is higher and higher. Basically, those are like small armies, of course, because they just have to cross the border or to send someone across the border and they can get access to big guns. Right? And there are other things that we can think here. Indeed, there is, for example, research that has shown or associated the emergence of the gangs in Central America, the MS-13, those kind of the gangs, to basically the deportations from the US in the 80s. So they have shown that basically those areas where the U.S. deported people in the 80s that were in U.S. prisons is the same areas where the criminal actors emerged in El Salvador. And it's because they learned from the U.S. Gangs, because the U.S. gangs typically are prison gangs. So most of these migrants, before they were deported from the U.S., they learned from these gangs, and when they came back to El Salvador, they created their own version there. So there are many things like that. That is like this relationship between the U.S. And us that I will say is kind of a hard relationship. Of course, it could be good for some things, but it's very bad for some other things. So yeah, this is hard to know.
Yeah, and as I guess you're pointing out, while it's really important to look at the macro factors because it gives us context, the work that you're doing, ethnography, is looking at a local level, humanizes everyone that you're looking at much more deeply, and you have much more of a personal level of engagement with the situation. And I think that that's something we miss so often. So I really appreciate that you're getting to give us a lens into what it's actually like, because so often we can have certain conceptions of what it means to live in a city with 150 gangs. And this kind of, I think, allows us to have a lot more nuance in understanding what it actually is like to live in that situation, and why maybe brute force, just pummeling people into the ground isn't the healthiest way to attempt to resolve that problem.
Yeah, indeed. One of the most common questions that I receive is, why do these criminal actors talk with you? And I think what you just mentioned, that's the answer. Indeed, it's like there is this thing when you talk to people in which you are humanizing them, you are showing them respect for what they have to tell you. And for many of these people, and just criminal actors, I have conducted interviews with criminal actors, like with paramilitaries, for guerrilla members, but also with normal residents, and most of them, they don't have someone asking them about their opinions. This is a person, like an external person, that suddenly is very interested in their story, in what they think, in how they live. And for some of them, or most of them, I will say, is the first time that happens. And yeah, and that's what I love about ethnographic work. It's very hard to do, I will say. Sometimes I just think that it's way easier just to go back to statistical analysis and running code and things like that, because there is a lot of effort into ethnographic work, but it has this very beautiful part in which you really engage with people. You really, every time that I'm thinking on an interview, I'm remembering the face of that person, the feelings that they transmitted to me when they were interviewed, and that is kind of like a very big nice benefit of like talking with them directly.
I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, David.
No, thank you so much, Johan, for having me. Thank you so much.